20 banned stories from Appalachia so disturbing they were never taught in school. Deep in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to ancient hollows and silence guards terrible secrets, there existed families whose bloodlines remained untouched by the outside world for generations. These are the stories they tried to erase from history. The year was 1897 when traveler Jonathan Pritchard first stumbled upon the Fugate settlement in Troublesome Creek. What he witnessed would haunt him until his dying day. The community consisted of 17 families, all bearing the surname Forgate, living in wooden shacks scattered across a remote valley, accessible only by a treacherous mountain pass. But it wasn't the poverty that shocked Pritchard. It was their skin. Every member of the Fugate clan possessed an unnatural blue complexion, a phenomenon that defied medical understanding at the time. Their faces, hands, and bodies displayed a distinctive cerulean hue that marked them as different, as cursed. Martin Fougat, the patriarch, who'd arrived from France in 1820, had unknowingly carried a recessive genetic trait. When he married his cousin Elizabeth Smith, who carried the same hidden mutation, their children inherited a blood disorder that would define generations. The Fugats lived in complete isolation, marrying exclusively within their extended family network. Brothers married sisters, cousins wed cousins, and uncles took nieces as wives. The practice wasn't born from malice, but from necessity and ignorance. In these forgotten mountains, where the nearest town lay 3 days' journey away, they knew no other way. Their isolation was both geographical and social, as neighboring communities shunned them, calling them the Blue People and spreading rumors of demonic possession. By 1925, the Fugate population had grown to 43 individuals, all exhibiting varying degrees of the blue skin condition. Dr. Samuel Harding, a physician from Lexington, traveled to Troublesome Creek to investigate. His journals, later sealed by the state medical board, described scenes that challenged his understanding of human genetics and social norms. The youngest generation showed the most severe physical manifestations. 7-year-old Rebecca Forgate could barely walk due to skeletal deformities. Her spine curved unnaturally and her legs bent at impossible angles. Her brother Thomas, age 9, possessed cognitive abilities far below normal development. He could speak only in fragmented sentences and required constant supervision. Their parents, who were first cousins, twice removed, seemed resigned to their children's condition, viewing it as God's will rather than the consequence of their intermarriage patterns. Dr. Harding documented 12 families within the Fugate settlement where parents shared bloodlines closer than third cousins. The medical complications extended far beyond blue skin. Infant mortality reached 70%, with most babies perishing before their first birthday. Those who survived often bore physical abnormalities, misshapen heads, missing digits, organs positioned incorrectly within their bodies. One child was born with eyes so far apart they couldn't focus on the same object simultaneously. The social structure within the settlement reflected their genetic isolation. Elder Benjamin Forgate, Ahed 67, had fathered children with 3 of his daughters, justifying the unions by citing biblical precedents and the scarcity of suitable partners. His granddaughter wife Martha, only 19 years old, had already lost 4 infants to mysterious ailments. She sat in her cabin doorway, rocking an empty cradle, her blue-tinged tears falling onto worn wood as she hummed lullabies to ghosts. Neighboring communities whispered about the Forgates, but maintained a fearful distance. Stories circulated about children born with strange deformities, about families that kept their most afflicted members hidden in root cellars and attics. Local preachers declared the Blue People cursed for their sinful practices. Though none dared venture into Troublesome Creek to save souls, the Fugates existed in a liminal space, neither fully part of society nor completely separate, trapped by geography and their own choices. As autumn descended upon the Appalachian mountains in 19, painting the forests in shades of amber and crimson, Dr. Harding prepared his report for the state medical board. His hands trembled as he wrote the final paragraph describing conditions that would surely provoke action. The Forgate settlement represented a medical catastrophe decades in the making, a living laboratory of genetic consequences that demanded intervention. But the intervention would never come before Dr. Harding could submit his findings. His research papers mysteriously disappeared from his hotel room. Local authorities claimed they had no record of his visit to Troublesome Creek. The state medical board denied receiving any correspondence regarding the Fugates. It was as if someone had decided that some truths were too disturbing to acknowledge. Confiro. These forbidden stories reveal the darkest chapters of American history that powerful forces tried to erase. Because understanding our past, no matter how disturbing, prevents us from repeating it 40 miles southwest of Troublesome Creek, another family's story unfolded in even more horrifying fashion. The Whitaker clan of odd West Virginia had maintained their bloodline's purity for 6 generations by the time researchers discovered them in 1932. Unlike the Forgates, whose condition was visible, the Whitakers' genetic deterioration manifested in ways both subtle and devastating. The family patriarch Josiah Whitaker controlled a 100-acre plot of mountainland that had passed through family hands since 1847. His great-grandfather had purchased the isolated property specifically to maintain what he called bloodline integrity. The Whitaker philosophy held that mixing with outsiders would dilute their strength, their heritage, their very essence. So they married within the family generation after generation, creating a genetic bottleneck that would prove catastrophic. By 1932, the Whitaker family consisted of 21 individuals living in 4 connected structures that formed a small compound. Anthropologist Dr. Elalini West documented her visit and field notes that the Smithsonian Institution would later classify and seal for 75 years. What she witnessed challenged every assumption about human adaptability and survival. The family communicated through an elaborate system of grunts, gestures, and nonsensical syllables that Dr. West initially mistook for a foreign language after weeks of observation. She realized with growing horror that most family members lacked the cognitive capacity for structured speech. Generations of intermarriage had resulted in severe intellectual disabilities affecting all but 3 individuals. In the settlement, twins Ezra and Esther Whitaker, aged 42, functioned as the family's caretakers and decision-makers. They were themselves the product of a union between siblings, but had somehow avoided the worst genetic consequences. Ezra could read and write at a basic level, while Esther managed the household and tended to family members who couldn't care for themselves. The twins had married each other 15 years prior, producing 5 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. Their eldest daughter, 16-year-old Pearl, existed in a perpetual state of confusion, her eyes widely spaced and unfocused, never seemed to land on anything specific. She wandered the compound in circles, picking up objects and dropping them, occasionally making sounds that might have been laughter or crying. Pearl's physical development had stopped at age 12, leaving her trapped between childhood and adulthood, her mind unable to bridge the gap. Dr. West's most disturbing observations involved the family's youngest members. 8 children under the age of 10 lived in the compound, all products of unions between first-degree relatives. 6 of the 8 couldn't walk unassisted. Their legs, thin and twisted, couldn't support their body weight. They crawled across the dirt floors, their movements both heartbreaking and unsettling. The 2 who could walk did so with pronounced limps, their gaits awkward and painful to witness. The family's medical conditions extended beyond physical and cognitive impairments. Hemophilia ran rampant through the bloodline inherited from a single carrier for generations back. Minor cuts became life-threatening events. The family cemetery behind the compound contained 47 graves, most marking children who had perished before age 5. Fresh mounds indicated recent losses, the earth still dark and loose from digging. Esther Whitaker showed Dr. West their family Bible where births, marriages, and deaths had been meticulously recorded since 1847. The marriage entries revealed patterns that made the anthropologist's stomach turn. Brothers married sisters with disturbing regularity. Fathers wed daughters when wives died in childbirth. Uncles claimed nieces as brides when suitable cousins weren't available. The family tree didn't branch. It tangled into a genetic knot that grew tighter with each generation. The Whitakers understood on some level that their practices caused problems. Ezra confided to Dr. West during a rare moment of candor that he knew his children weren't right in the head. But what choice did they have? Ask it. The outside world feared them, mocked them, treated them as less than human. Within their compound, they found acceptance, even if that acceptance came wrapped in tragedy. Local authorities in Odd knew about the Whitakers, but maintained a policy of deliberate ignorance. Sheriff Clayton Burke, when questioned by Dr. West, shrugged and stated that mountain people handled their own affairs. The county had no resources to care for individuals with severe disabilities, he explained. Better to let the Whitakers manage themselves than burden taxpayers with their problems. His callousness reflected broader societal attitudes toward isolated mountain communities. Dr. West attempted to convince Esther to allow some of the children to receive medical evaluation and potential treatment in Charleston. The suggestion provoked an immediate and hostile response. Esther declared that outsiders wanted to steal their children to break apart their family. The compound gates previously open were locked and barred. Dr. West was politely but firmly asked to leave and never return. Before departing, Dr. West witnessed one final scene that would appear in her nightmares 4 years afterward. Young Pearl stood at the compound fence, her unfocused eyes somehow finding the departing anthropologist. The girl raised one twisted hand in what might have been a wave or a plea for help. Dr. West never could determine which. The image of that raised hand emerging from the fog-shrouded compound represented everything tragic about the Whitaker legacy, a desperate reach toward a world forever beyond their grasp. The autumn of 1938 brought federal attention to Appalachia as hidden communities, when President Roosevelt's New Deal programs expanded into the most remote mountain regions. Works Progress Administration workers, tasked with building roads and infrastructure, began encountering families whose existence challenged modern understanding of American society. What they discovered in the hills of eastern Tennessee would force the government to confront uncomfortable truths about its own citizens. The Colton family inhabited a valley so isolated that it appeared on no official maps. 23 individuals, all bearing genetic markers of extreme consanguinity, lived in conditions that WPA Supervisor James Morrison described as his reports filed with federal authorities and subsequently buried in classified archives detailed a community where the gene pool had shrunk to the point of collapse. Morrison's crew first encountered 14-year-old Jacob Colton attempting to repair a fence with tools he clearly didn't understand how to use. The boy's physical appearance immediately indicated severe genetic problems. His head, disproportionately large, sat atop a small, twisted body. His jaw jutted forward unnaturally, leaving him unable to close his mouth completely. Drool constantly dripped from his lips, which he wiped with the back of a deformed hand that possessed only 3 fingers. Jacob led the workers to the family compound, a collection of ramshackle buildings that seemed to defy gravity in their precarious construction. The structures leaned against each other like drunken companions, their walls warped and roofs sagging under accumulated neglect. Inside these buildings, Morrison's crew discovered scenes that would haunt them for decades. The Colton family patriarch, 68-year-old Amos, had fathered children with 4 of his daughters over a 30-year period. His youngest wife, Rachel, was only 24, but looked 50. Her body aged prematurely by repeated pregnancies and inadequate nutrition. She nursed an infant whose skull hadn't properly formed, the soft spot extending across most of its head, covered only by thin skin that pulsed with each heartbeat. The family's eldest member, 82-year-old grandmother Sarah, sat in a rocking chair that had worn grooves into the wooden floor. Her mind, sharp despite her advanced age, held memories spanning the family's descent into genetic catastrophe. She spoke freely to Morrison, perhaps recognizing her final opportunity to tell their story before death claimed her. Sarah remembered when outsiders still visited the valley before the family's reputation drove them away. She recalled her own parents, who had been second cousins, and how people whispered about their union, but ultimately accepted it as mountain custom. She witnessed her son Amos marry his cousin Temperance, and later, after Temperance's death in childbirth, take his own daughters as wives to continue the family line. "We didn't know no better," Sarah told Morrison, her gnarled hands gripping her chair's armrests. "The preacher said family was sacred, that keeping the bloodline pure was righteous. We believed him because we didn't know what pure meant. We thought it meant strong." Not her voice trailed off as her eyes swept across the compound, taking in the evidence of their terrible mistake. Morrison documented 14 children and young adults in the Colton compound, none without significant physical or mental impairments. Twins, Thomas and Timothy, both 17, shared a condition where their spines curved so severely they could barely stand upright. They moved in shuffling steps, their bodies bent nearly double, their faces forever looking at the ground. Communication with them proved impossible. They seemed to understand simple commands, but couldn't form coherent responses. 9-year-old patients represented perhaps the most tragic case born to a mother and father who were half-siblings. She exhibited profound developmental delays alongside physical deformities. Her legs grew at different rates, making one limb 4 inches shorter than the other. Her cognitive abilities hadn't progressed beyond those of a toddler. She sat in the dirt, playing with rocks and sticks, occasionally making sounds that might have been attempts at speech, or simply vocalizations without meaning. The compound's makeshift infirmary contained 3 beds where the most severely affected family members spent their days. Morrison observed them briefly before requesting to be excused, his composure cracking. 2 adults and 1 child lay in those beds, their conditions so extreme that description seemed obscene. Suffice to say, that genetic catastrophe had rendered them unable to perform basic human functions without assistance. Local physician Dr. Marcus Webb had treated the Coltons sporadically over the years, though his visits had grown less frequent as the family's genetic problems intensified. He confided to Morrison that medical science offered no solutions for the Coltons. The damage was done, written into every cell of their bodies. The only ethical response would be preventing further intermarriage. But the family refused outside intervention. Morrison attempted to explain to Amos Colton that his practices were harming his family, that bringing in partners from outside the bloodline could prevent future suffering. Amos responded with anger and suspicion. Outsiders didn't understand their ways, he declared. The government wanted to destroy their family, to scatter them like seeds in the wind. They would remain together, he insisted, come what may. Comment on this story with your thoughts. What would you have done if you discovered a community like this? Share the phrase, family traditions should never come at the cost of innocent children's well-being. The WPA workers completed their assigned tasks and departed the valley, leaving the Coltons to their isolation. Morrison's reports traveled through bureaucratic channels, landing on desks where officials read them with horror before filing them away. No intervention was authorized. The policy of non-inference in mountain communities remained intact, sacrificing the Culatons and families like them on the altar of political expediency. The winter of 1945 brought unprecedented snow to the Appalachian Mountains, isolating already remote communities under blankets of white that would persist until spring. In the hills of southwestern Virginia, the Blackwood family faced their harshest season yet, though the cold proved less dangerous than the genetic legacy they carried in their blood. Social worker Margaret Chun, one of the few minority professionals working in Appalachia, received assignment to check on isolated families during the brutal winter. Her journey to the Blackwood homestead required 2 days of travel through treacherous mountain passages. The final miles accomplished on foot through snow that reached her waist. What she discovered justified every difficult step. The Blackwood compound housed 19 individuals representing 4 generations of systematic interbreeding. Unlike the Fugates' blueskin or the Whitakers' cognitive impairments, the Blackwoods suffered from a devastating combination of physical deformities that left most family members barely able to function independently. Family matriarch Virginia Blackwood, Arge 56, greeted Margaret with surprising warmth. Virginia could walk only with assistance, her legs twisted from childhood rickets exacerbated by genetic factors, but her mind remained sharp, and she recognized that Margaret's visit might represent their only chance for outside help before spring. With painful honesty, Virginia shared their family's secret history. The Blackwood lineage traced back to 1872, when siblings Marcus and Louisa Blackwood had fled their hometown after their forbidden romance became public knowledge. They settled in the Virginia mountains, assuming new identities and presenting themselves as cousins rather than siblings. Their children, unaware of their parents' true relationship, married each other, compounding the genetic risks exponentially. By the 3rd generation, every child born to the Blackwood family exhibited some form of physical abnormality. The family tree, which Virginia showed Margaret, revealed a pattern of so extreme that calculating exact relationships became nearly impossible. Everyone was related to everyone else through multiple pathways, creating a genetic maze with no exit. Margaret met 12-year-old Daniel Blackwood, whose condition exemplified the family's genetic catastrophe. Daniel's skeletal structure had developed asymmetrically, leaving his right side significantly larger than his left. His right arm hung nearly to his knee, while his left barely reached his hip. His face showed the same imbalance with features that didn't align properly. Despite these challenges, Daniel possessed normal intelligence and communicated clearly, making his situation even more heartbreaking. He understood his difference, felt his isolation, mourned his limitations. The compound's children, 8 in total, played together in the snow, but their games reflected their physical constraints. None could run normally. Some crawled on all fours, Others supported themselves on crude crutches, fashioned from tree branches. Their laughter, genuine and innocent, contrasted sharply with their visible suffering, creating cognitive dissonance that Margaret struggled to process. Virginia's daughter-in-law, 28-year-old Catherine, had recently given birth to her sixth child. 5 previous infants had died within days of birth, their tiny bodies too malformed to sustain life. This newest baby, a girl named Hope, seemed healthier than her siblings, but examination revealed the cruel truth. Hope had been born with her internal organs partially exposed, covered only by a thin membrane. Dr. Chun, though not a physician, recognized that the infant's survival past infancy was medically unlikely. Catherine held Hope constantly, as if her embrace could somehow protect the baby from Janan and destiny. She sang lullababas in a voice cracked by grief, rocking the infant gently while snow fell outside the cabin windows. Margaret watched this scene unfold, understanding that she was witnessing love's futile battle against biological inevitability. The family's eldest member, 74-year-old grandfather, William, represented the last link to their original ancestors' decision. He remembered stories his grandmother had told about Marcus and Louisa, fleeing persecution for their forbidden love. At the time, their choice seemed romantic, defiant. 70 years later, their great-great-grandchildren paid the price for that romance in twisted bones and shortened lives. William showed Margaret the family cemetery where 63 graves marked short lives, cut even shorter by genetic disease. Most headstones bore dates spanning days or weeks rather than years. Some graves held multiple siblings, victims of the same inherited conditions that had killed them within hours of each other. The cemetery represented the family's true legacy. Generations of suffering etched in stone. Margaret documented everything. The physical conditions, the family relationships, the living circumstances, the desperate need for medical intervention. A report submitted to state authorities in February 1946 recommended immediate action, including genetic counseling, medical treatment, and potentially removing the youngest children to prevent further harm. The response came swiftly. Budget constraints prevented intervention. The Blackwoods, like other isolated mountain families, would have to manage on their own. Margaret's passionate advocacy fell on sympathetic but ultimately powerless ears. The system, such as it was, had no capacity to address generational genetic catastrophe on this scale. Before leaving the Blackwood compound, Margaret made a promise she knew she might not keep. She would return in the spring, bring in medical supplies and hopefully better news. Young Daniel watched her depart, his asymmetrical body silhouetted against the snow, his uneven hand raised in farewell. Margaret turned away, tears freezing on her cheeks, carrying the weight of witnessing suffering she couldn't relieve. The stories of the Fugits, Whitakers, Coltons, and Blackwoods represent just 4 examples among countless families, whose genetic legacies were shaped by isolation and intermarriage throughout Appalachian history. By the early 1950s, researchers had identified at least 37 distinct communities where consanguinity rates exceeded 50%, creating pockets of concentrated genetic disorders that persisted into the modern era. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, a geneticist working for the Centers for Disease Control in 1953, compiled a comprehensive study examining the long-term effects of sustained intermarriage in isolated populations. Her research, classified until 2003, revealed patterns that challenged assumptions about human adaptability and survival. The data painted a devastating picture of communities trapped by geography, poverty, and tradition, and cycles of genetic deterioration. The study documented infant mortality rates in these communities, reaching as high as 85% in some family groups. Physical deformities affected virtually every surviving child to some degree. Cognitive impairments ranged from mild learning difficulties to profound intellectual disabilities requiring constant care. Life expectancy averaged just 42 years compared to 68 years in the general American population at the time. Dr. Rodriguez visited sites across 5 states, meeting families whose stories echoed those already documented. In eastern Kentucky, she encountered the Ramsey clan, where 9 generations of intermarriage had produced a population unable to digest most foods due to inherited metabolic disorders. They survived on a limited diet that barely provided adequate nutrition, their bodies slowly starving despite eating. In western North Carolina, the Dockery family exhibited a genetic condition affecting their connective leaving joints so loose the dislocations occurred during routine activities. Children learned to pop their shoulders and hips back into place, the way others might crack their knuckles. The pain was constant, but they had known nothing else. Their normal was agony. Tennessee's Pritchard settlement housed families where hereditary deafness affected 90% of the population. Generations of silence had created a unique sign language incomprehensible to outsiders. When Dr. Rodriguez attempted to communicate through an interpreter using standard American Sign Language, the Pritchards couldn't understand. Their isolation extended even to how they processed the world. Each community Dr. Rodriguez studied shared common elements: geographic isolation, poverty, suspicion of outsiders, and a tragic ignorance of genetics that led to devastating choices. The families loved each other, cared for their disabled members as best they could, and maintained dignity despite impossible circumstances. Their situations reflected not moral failings, but rather the intersection of limited options and insufficient knowledge. The scientific explanation for their conditions was straightforward but brutal. Humans carry thousands of genes, many recessive and harmless when paired with different variants from unrelated partners. When close relatives reproduce, the probability of matching harmful recessive genes increases dramatically. First cousin marriages double the risk of genetic disorders. Sibling unions quadruple it. Parent-to-child relationships create nearly inevitable catastrophe. Over multiple generations, the genetic diversity necessary for healthy populations evaporates. The gene pool shrinks, concentrating harmful mutations while eliminating beneficial variation. Eventually, a population reaches what geneticists call genetic load threshold, where the accumulated mutations make survival increasingly difficult. Many Appalachian families Dr. Rodriguez studied had crossed that threshold, their future increasingly uncertain. The question facing authorities was what, if anything, could be done. Forcibly separating families violated fundamental rights, yet allowing the patent to continue condemned future generations to suffering. Educational programs required willing participants, which many isolated families refused to become. Medical interventions could treat symptoms, but not reverse genetic damage already present. Some families chose different paths. The Fugates eventually allowed outsiders into their community, diluting the blue skin condition over several generations. By the 1970s, the characteristic Chiruan complexion had largely disappeared, though carriers of the gene remained. The family's choice to open their bloodlines came too late for many, but saved their descendants from continued deterioration. Other families vanished from records entirely. The Whitakers, Coltons, and Blackwoods simply stopped appearing in census data. After the 1960s, whether they died out, dispersed, or simply became better at avoiding official notice remains unknown. Their stories survive only in sealed documents and fading memories of those who witnessed their struggles. If you've watched until this point, you've learned truths about American history that many would prefer remained buried. These families' experiences reveal how isolation, poverty, and lack of education created tragedies that should never have occurred. Their stories matter because they remind us that every community deserves access to knowledge and resources that prevent such suffering. Now, it's your turn to help ensure these stories aren't forgotten again. If you watched until here, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here so I can meet you and know who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another chapter of hidden American history. Hit the like button to help others discover these important stories. Share this video with anyone who believes that understanding our past, no matter how disturbing, is essential to building a better future. The forbidden stories of Appalachia teach us that some knowledge, no matter how painful, cannot remain buried forever. Truth has a way of emerging, demanding recognition, insisting that we bear witness to suffering even when it makes us uncomfortable. These families existed. They struggled. They loved and lost and persevered under circumstances we can barely imagine. Their legacy challenges us to ensure that isolation and ignorance never again combine to create such preventable tragedy. Remember their stories, honor their memory, and work toward a future where every child, regardless of geography or circumstance, has the opportunity for health, education, and hope.